Today we're reading Chapter 5 of The Great and Terrible Quest. The first part of their journey was quiet, uneventful, and full of happiness that Trad had never known. Juan put aside, except sometimes at night when the child was asleep, any attempt to remember all that was locked in his mind, and devoted himself to Trad as the wise woman had done. After 6 years of learning nothing except what he could pick up for himself, Trad soaked up teaching like a sponge. Juan seemed to know almost as much about wildlife as the wise woman herself, and he knew so much more. He taught Trad to pick out tunes on the lute, the words and music of songs of all sorts, courtly and country, grave and gay, sorrowful and comic, what to say and how to behave to kings, lords and ladies, and all manner of ordinary people, how to buy and how to sell, how to bespeak a room at an inn when there was money, and how to find shelter free when there was none. All this and 100 other things filled Trad's days with enthralling interest. The white-haired man spoke of foreign countries as if he had traveled through them, of courts as if he had lived in them, of the miseries of the poor as if he had shared in them. Trad learned quickly not to ask if this was true, because the slightest reference to the man's personal past brought a clouded, vacant look into his eyes. Instead, he asked questions differently, storing eagerly in his mind the information which came out so casually and unthinkingly. One night, as he obediently rubbed some of the ointment from the little round box into the roots of his hair, the wise woman had been urgent he must never forget this. He said thoughtfully, "I ought to speak like a country person, like the wise woman, oughtn't I?" Juan, who was laboriously cutting 2 thick sticks from a young oak, said over his shoulder without much attention, "The wise woman is no countrywoman. I have no doubt she is of good birth and came with her husband from foreign parts, driven out by some wickedness in her own land, perhaps." A shadow came over his face, and Trad said quickly, to distract him from the sorrow of the world, "And learned our language from the country people. But shouldn't I speak like that?" Juan had twisted the second of the sticks free and brought them both to their little camp, sitting down to trim them smooth. "No need," he said absently. "All but the very poorest minstrels copy the speech of the great folk, and one who has been successful would teach his grandchild, so no matter how low he is sunk. It would be safe also when traveling as a friar or a priest, since either one might be from a good family, as a merchant of the richer sort, or as a palmer or pilgrim, or a man-at-arms at home from the holy wars." All those were disguises this man had used, thought Trad instantly. He tried to think of a good way of finding out more, but Juan had risen from his great height. "Come, child," he said, to his great height. "Come, child," he said, with a quick flash of laughter Trad had come to love. "Tuck up those skirts and learn how to hold a sword." With a shriek of excitement, Trad scrambled up. Having worn the skirts for 2 days before they started out, he got used to the feel of them around his legs, only thankful that they were not, like the older woman's, right down to the ground. But it was enjoyable to tuck them up under his belt and become a boy again. After years of daydreaming about sword fights in which he defeated single-handedly Diamond and all his band, it was sobering to do nothing for what seemed like hours except hold the stick out in front of him while Juan patiently altered the grip of his fingers or the angle of his wrist. But he learned this, like everything else, very quickly, and it was not really long before he was faithfully copying strokes, first of defense and then of attack. "A born swordsman like your grandfather," said Juan, deeply intent on the boy. Trad opened his mouth to ask eagerly if he meant grandfather, and so he knew about him, but the man seemed quite unaware of what he had said. "Come now, child, put it into practice," he said briskly, and went down on his knees, still even then considerably taller than Trad. "Now hit me." Here's a picture of them fighting with the swords. So they were practicing. His eyes laughed, but Trad started doubtfully, troubled by the thought of that fearful half-healed wound on the man's head. What would happen if he hit the head again? He soon found that there was no possibility of that. His half-hearted thrust met a defense as impenetrable as an oaken wall, and he was soon trying his hardest, using every stroke he'd been shown, and a few two-handed whacks of his own that made Juan laugh, as without shifting his position, he caught each blow on his stick. "Wrist up," he sometimes said, or "loosen your grip, you're not using the hammer." And then at the end, as Trad came to him on a breathless standstill, good, good and very good. Trad could have burst with pride. From this, a champion of champions. He hardly knew he had said the words aloud until Juan, who had been getting rather stiffly to his feet, turned sharply. Why do you call me that? He asked with a startling bitterness. I have not fought an attorney since I was 17. Trad held his breath, hoping for more, but instead the dreaded change came. Because, said Juan, his eyes suddenly vague and distraught. Because I've forgotten why. I forget. Trad tried in vain to comfort him, and though he finally lay down and seemed to sleep, he tossed and turned all night, moaning or weeping. In the morning he was so broken that Trad suggested they should spend a day quietly resting. At once the man was on his feet. No, no, he cried wildly. We must not stay this time. Remembering what one of the country lords had said about the shortness of time, the boy dared not argue. With a heavy heart, he began to gather their things together. Up to now, they'd been making a big circle around to avoid villages, but today they would have to pass through a small market town. With Juan in this state, Trad himself would have to see everything. When he had not known how ignorant he had been cheerfully confident about this journey. But now that he was beginning to understand how complicated ordinary life was, he was afraid of all the mistakes he could make. But he must just do the best he could. So with as cheerful a look as he could manage, he hung the wallet with the small remnants of their food over Juan's shoulder, himself took the lute and the sticks they had used as swords, and whistled to Jokey, who was sitting hopefully outside a rabbit hole. The little dog always whined and struggled if he was picked up first thing, but he could not walk far, and Trad used to watch him for the right moment to pick him up. This morning he was also having to watch Juan, who stumbled on looking really like an old man, his face dull and weary, his broad shoulders bent as he leaned heavily on a tall stick. And so it happened that it was the man, looking always down at the ground, who first noticed Jokey in distress. He stood still. Alas, alas, he murmured, and stooped to pick up the tired little dog. Trad thought of Jokey as his responsibility and would have never asked Juan to share any of the trouble with him. But as they walked, he glanced sideways at the little dog cradled so gently in the crook of the big man's arm, covered in his cloak, until only the pricked black ears showed, and it seemed to him that having something to look after had pierced through Juan's true self, and that the clouds hung less heavily on him. He did not talk, but gradually he began to look about him with a brightening eye, and as they came to the scattered huts on the outskirts of town, he drew himself up with something like alertness, muttering that it must be market day. They had joined the main track now, and for the first time they were beginning to see people who, singing in groups, hurried along the way they were going themselves. Now that Juan was better, the boy forgot his fears, and in his enormous interest in all that was going on. Juan shifted his stick and reached down to take his hand, and Trad skipped along beside him, quite unaware of the charming picture he made in his cloak of patches and rich crimson dress, his eyes large and brilliant with excitement beneath the dancing dark curls and gay ribbon. People glanced at the lovely child and paused to look a second time, while Trad met their glances with fearless gaiety, thinking that he had never expected people to be quite so smiling and friendly. Where were the misery and wickedness spoken about with such heavy sighs? But he did not have to wait long to see. As they drew near one poor, tumble-down wattle hut, loud wails of despair and angry curses suddenly broke out. The door was kicked open, and a thick-set man shouldered his way out, carrying the limp body of a very young man, while a desperate woman clawed ineffectively at his jerkin. There, he tossed the boy roughly onto the thick grass. When I say get out, you'll get out. The woman, suddenly silent, fell on her knees beside the boy, who was moving feebly and whimpering as nettles stung his bare skin. Trad, rigid with distress, caught the sleeve of a man among the group of people who had stopped for a moment to look and were now beginning to hurry on. Sir, he said, and then when he was unable to find more words, I gasped, Why? The man took a casual look downwards, and the hard indifference of his expression softened a little. Why, 'tis simple enough for sure. The woman's husband have died, and there be none to do a farmer's work in payment for the cottage. So farmer takes the cottage, and the woman must get out." The woman looked as if she had caught the words. Looked up as if she'd caught the words. "Oh, good people," she cried wildly, "us asked only for time. My son be sick and have no food, has passed our lips for 3 days. When can I leave him? When I can earn a few coins to pay Carter to take us to my sister's. The boy will be too sick to walk." "Time," said the farmer, and he spat it noisily. "Time be money," and he strode away. "Us have little enough to keep her," muttered the man Trad was still clutching. A closed, mean look came over his face as he edged away and looked quickly around Trad. And looking quickly around, Trad saw the same expression on all those who were hurrying by. Though the woman's laments and explanations still filled the air, only one very fat man, in clothes gayer but more ragged than everyone else's, hesitated for a little and then went slowly on. At that moment, a bundle was put quietly into the boy's arms. Startled, he looked down to see Jokey, wrapped tight around Juan's cloak. The man himself was on his knees, dividing the remains of their food into 2 small portions. One he started to replace in the wallet, but Trad crouched quickly beside him. "Can they have all of mine?" he whispered. Juan looked at him for a moment, then touched the share he had been putting away. "This is all yours." "If you can do without, of course I can," he said, and picked up the few pieces and gave it to the woman. For a while she did not seem to understand what he was offering her, and then she turned at once and gave it to her son. Juan was already there. He had soaked his share of bread in the small amount of wine there still was in grandfather's flask, and that was still in grandfather's flask, and patiently and tenderly fed the sick child from his horn spoon. He glanced around at the mother. "If you will trust me, I have been a healer." He stopped to look down at the man, his own hands in bewilderment. "I think," he finished, his voice shaking in uncertainty. Trad feared that his mind was going to wander again, but that moment the little boy opened his eyes and cried out in fear at the strange bearded face above him. His look was at once calm and confident. Juan turned to comforting him, soothing him against his shoulder, and then gently feeling his forehead and his neck and leaning an ear against his chest. "Grandpère," said Trad, remembering just in time what name he must use, and speaking with pride and love, "is very clever." The woman was staring at them both as if they were angels from heaven. When Juan told her that the fever was breaking, all the child needed was warmth and food. She nodded dumbly. "So we must get you to your sister," said Trad brightly. "Grandpère." He had already brought out the 2 little coins the wise woman had given him, and was looking at Juan for permission to give them. He got a bright flash of a smile, and their other 3 coins were dropped into his hand. "I will carry the child for you to the Carters," Juan said crisply, and stood up with the little boy in his arms. People were still hurrying by, casting curious glances at the small group, and the fat man in bright clothes, who had turned back abruptly at the corner, was watching them openly. Trad, too occupied with what they were doing to notice this, picked up Jokey, who was whining and struggling to free himself from the cloak. "Show us where to go," he said to the woman, and then practically, "But first, is there anything of yours to fetch from the house?" She shook her head. "Naught," she said dully. "We have nothing. It all went. Farmer took our goat when my man died, and the priest took the chicks, and every stick and clout have gone for a bite of food since." Juan glanced down at Trad's startled face, and as they walked in the direction the woman showed them, he explained the custom by which, on the death of the head of the household, the landlord took the best beast and the church the second best. His look warned the boy against saying the indignant words in his mind, and he went on to tell the woman that his little granddaughter, coming from foreign parts, did not understand the ways of this country. "A blessed country ye must come from, where the customs be different," Juan sighed. "We are always on the road. We see little of the lives of those living on the land, but in truth, I think they differ little. The people work and the lords take." The woman looked around in terror. "Nay, nay, you must not say such words aloud," she whispered. "A many will run and tell the lords that do bring whipping and death. Alas, alas, the land. No law, no justice, no mercy." The heartbroken murmur could hardly be heard, but the woman looked with awe at the tears of pity and grief which rolled down Juan's face. Few there be, with even tears to spare for others, she muttered. They had reached the place where she would wait for the carter to pick her up on his way back from the market. Taking her boy, now sleeping dully and trustfully, she tried to find the words of thanks. And when she could not, she seized the man's hand and kissed it tearfully, and then stopped and kissed Trad. Never shall I forget thee, never, never, she said brokenly. Ah, if there were just more like you. Juan's face was ravaged by sorrow as hers when he turned away, and Trad did not speak to him. But his own heart felt as if it was bursting with feelings he could not understand. And as he walked silently beside the man towards the town once more, his chest heaved with silent sighs. Child, Juan stopped abruptly and sat down on a stone by the roadside. He drew Trad to him to stand between his knees. Tell me what is wrong. Stiff in his hand, Trad burst out. They don't help each other. They don't help each other. Grandfather said they didn't, and they don't. He could not come nearer to explaining his horror. He had kept himself from sinking into despair in his life with Grandfather by believing that only Grandfather and his friends were wicked, cruel, and greedy. Sure that everything Grandfather had said must be untrue, he had pictured a world outside where no matter what poverty or grief there might be, people were kind and gentle and ready to help each other. The society he had seen among the forest men had made this seem true, and it was not the fate of the woman, not even the behavior of the farmer and the priest, but the closed, mean faces of all the others as they hurried by, which had shattered the picture he had clung to. Yes, said Juan, as if he understood everything. His blue eyes were dark with a knowledge of grief Trad had only begun to glimpse, but steady, too, with courage and determination. Yet you helped me, child, and the wise woman helped us both. Trad stared at him, and then suddenly saw it. Not everyone was like Grandfather had said. He leaned thankfully against Juan's shoulder. And you helped that woman, he murmured. The man sighed, but did not speak of the necessarily small help it had been. Instead, he went on silently. And those others who do not help, where should they learn to do so? The king in his palace, the lords in their castles, the priests in their churches, think of nothing but themselves. They help no one, and they teach no one. If the rich do not help from their plenty, is it wonder that the poor do not help from their scarcity? Rather, is it a marvel that there are some who do? Remembering what the woman had said, Trad hastily looked around. No one was near enough to have heard, though the bright-clad man was again watching them from some distance away. But one word in particular had struck Trad. He whispered, if the king helped others, people would learn, wouldn't they? The High Prince Conrad wanted to help the poor if he became king. The High Prince Conrad is dead. The deep voice spoke with an unthinking certainty, but when Trad looked up with a shy eagerness to ask about the son of the high priest, the old dull look was back, and the man was muttering, I have forgotten. What is it? What is it? Grandpère, Trad spoke clearly and firmly. The fat man had come closer, and he was afraid of what Juan might say. What are we going to do for money? Shall we? He lowered his voice and guided Juan's hand to the stiff place in the waist of his dress where the wise woman had sewn the silver coins. The man stared at him blankly for a moment, and then intelligence and decision came back to his blue eyes. No, no, he said, getting up stiffly. Let us go on to the market. There is time enough to earn for tonight. The noise, bustle, and confusion of the market soon took Trad's mind away from the sad thoughts and perplexities. Everything was new and exciting. The people themselves were as interesting to him as the stalls, and he followed Juan, hanging on to his cloak for fear of losing him, with his eyes wide and bright. In the center of the marketplace near the cross, Juan stopped. He took the lute from Trad and struck the strings. Trad saw at once what the wise woman had meant. Though a juggler was walking on his hands and twirling a great platter with his feet only a few yards away, and a man was bawling at the people to come and see a rather mangy monkey jiggling up and down on the end of the chain, the crowds had been paying little attention to them, being still intent on the serious business of buying and selling. At the authority of that single chord, though, I want to make some music really badly, but I can't do it with my mouth, they nearly all heads turned towards them. The musician, leaning negligently across the against the cross itself. So he's leaning back on the cross. The musician negligently leaned against the cross itself, began a series of rippling chords, to which a deep and beautiful voice chanted, "Good people, listen to my lay. I've songs for you, both grave and gay. I'll make you laugh, I'll make you cry. I'll charm the pigs out from the sty, the baby from the gaping nurse, and showers of coins from your purse." Some people laughed and shouted, "Let's see you do it then." A flash of laughter answered him, and Juan began the song about the old woman and her pig. Very quickly, the crowds were standing 4 to 5 feet deep around them, applauding Jokey's little dance, watching with sympathetic smiles Trad's helpless laughter, and at the end themselves roaring and rolling about the fun of the old woman's troubles. "Now, joyeuse child," said Juan, quietly commanding, and played the tune of a short gay song he had taught Trad about the pleasures of each season in turn. His voice trembling a little with shyness at first, Trad soon forgot himself in the enjoyment of the song, and as when he curtsied breathlessly at the end, he heard exclamations from all over the crowd. "Oh, what a pretty little dear," they all said. He was equally enraptured by the success of his singing at the joke of him actually being a girl. Quite a little shower of coins rattled on the cobbles in front of them, and he pounced on them, flushed, laughed, and excited, chasing them under people's feet and the market stalls until he heard the slow tune of minor chords, which Juan was now playing. It belonged to one of Juan's songs he could hardly hear because it was a sad lament for a dead child. Stock still, standing with his hands full of coins clasped tightly to his chest, he heard it with tears brimming from his eyes and trickling down his pale cheeks. People listening to the song turned also to watch the child, and it was perhaps difficult to say whether more of them wept at the sound of the music or at the sight of the tragic little girl. Certainly, as the last soft note died away, there was in the very center of the market's hubbub a most extraordinary circle of quietness, where the only sound was low sobs of the women and the loud sniff and nose wipings of the men. Suddenly, a bold chord shattered the stillness. "Well, good people, have I done it?" challenged Juan's deep laughing voice. He was answered by a roar of acceptance, some rather shaky laughter, and another rattle of coins. He bowed with a courtly elegance, while Trad, laughing again now, did the very deep curtsy which the wise woman had practiced him, and then started to collect the coins, making a bag out of the front of his skirt and bringing the lot to Juan, who glanced casually at them and nodded. "Enough, enough," he said, and sounded weary and rather vague. With an anxious look at him, Trad sat down to count the money. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up in alarm, spreading his small hands protectively over the money. But the fat man, in bright ragged clothes, was not looking at him. His attention was entirely on Jokey. The little dog, wild with excitement, was alternately leaping up at the party-colored legs and turning perfect circles on his hind legs, his one front paw waving gaily. I think they found out who owned Jokey. Trad, staring in astonishment, recognized first the man who had watched them on the road, and then the juggler who had been performing on his hands. A juggler. "Oh!" His hands flew to his mouth. "Jokey is yours!" The man turned. Though the fat face was creased with laughter lines, his eyes were cool and watchful. "Jokey, you call him, do you? I call him Jester." As he said the word, he snapped his fingers, and the little dog dropped down on all three paws, braced himself, and then flung himself high in the air to land in the juggler's arms. Right after a snap, he jumped up into the juggler's arms. That's so cool. Trad scrambled up, bunching his skirt clumsily and to hold the money. "You threw him out when he lost his paw," he said fiercely. The fat man laughed. "Good try, but you're wrong," he said coolly. "He was stolen from me. The good-for-nothing rascal who played the pipe for his dancing made off with him. No doubt he threw him out when he lost his paw." Somehow Trad could not disbelieve him. Silently he turned his way and hid his face against Juan. Jokey would have to go with his real master, and he would not cry in front of this strange man. Juan was looking down at him, and as always, confronted with need, he was alert and decisive. "We will buy him from you," he said crisply. "Joyeuse?" Swallowing hard, Trad opened his skirt to show the coins. All of that would barely pay for a dog of this worth. Will you give all of that? The juggler said coolly. Trad opened his mouth eagerly, but Juan's hand came down on his shoulder. The man was frowning. The child has not eaten since this morning. So I can believe. There was an odd dryness in the tone. 2 coins, then. For the bread for the child and the rest for the dog. Juan nodded, and startlingly the man burst out laughing, all his rolls of fat shaking. Heaven guards fools and children, they say. Not that I have ever seen signs of it. Suppose I take your money. You can see that the dog knows he's mine. A whistle in the night, and there you are. No dog, no money. Now will you pay me for him? Should he pay him? Bewildered, Trad glanced at him and then looked up at Juan. A little smile was half hidden in the depths of the curly white beard, and Trad's heart leaped up. He still did not understand, but if Juan thought it was all right, he turned at once to the juggler, offering his open skirt. Take it all, he said eagerly. I can do without food, and Jokey will be able to find something for himself among the stalls. Not so fast, not so fast. I have a different plan to offer. There was a little smile still on Juan's lips. So I thought, he murmured. The fat man gave him a rather startled, doubtful look, and then began to speak very fast, telling them that without the dog, who he himself had trained from a puppy, his act had been less successful, and he had fallen on hard times. Also, he needed music, and then he would have to act without compare. Unexpectedly, Juan laughed, a deep sound of genuine amusement. And will the addition of a juggler improve our act? He asked. Again, the juggler seemed disconcerted, and Trad thought that he must have seen Juan in one of his vague moments and supposed he would be easy to manage. But he quickly recovered himself. At least it will make sure that you're getting something to eat, he retorted. Today already I've seen you give away all your food, all your money, and ready a second time to give away all your money again. Heaven knows how you have got as far as you have. No doubt it does, said Juan dryly. So you will join us to protect us then. On the whole, this seemed to Trad a good idea, even apart from making sure that Jokey stayed with them. But he was puzzled to know that they could tell whether the juggler was to be trusted. Could they tell? Again, he looked up at Juan, and he saw that he was looking steadily at the fat man. At first, the cool, light eyes avoided the brilliant blue ones. Then suddenly they turned to meet them. There was a very short silence. Agreed, Juan said quietly. The juggler bent to put Jokey in Trad's arms. Agreed, he said rather huskily. And here's the juggler and Juan. A new picture of them. That is the end of chapter 5.